We're continuing the Maimer Mimona Afar Yaakov that the Rebbe said on Yud Beis Tammuz, Shabbos Parshas Chulkas Balak, Tafshin Yud Beis. As we began earlier to explain, the Maimer is explaining to us how one leaves their constraints, their physical and spiritual constraints, min ha-meitzad. And the way to do it, the way the neshama leaves its constraints, can be understood from Yetzias Mitzrayim, because the ultimate meitzar, and the root and source for all the other galias, which is all the other constraints that a person can feel, both personal and general communal galus. The way to leave it is the same way that the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, left Egypt. Regarding Metzias Mitzrayim, it says, Midaleg alehorim mikapetz alagvois, that Hashem brought about the exodus from Mitzrayim in a way of dilug, in a way of jumping over, skipping over. And similarly, when for a person to leave their own constraints that they find themselves in, the way to do that is specifically, as we explained earlier in the Maimer, in a way of bitachon, trust in Hashem, but the trust in Hashem must be a total trust. One that's in a way of skipping over, of jumping over beyond all limitations, fully beyond all limitations. In order to understand that, so we began to explain, the Rebbe explains in the Maimer the difference between the three types of Avodah, of Amida, Hiluch, and Dilug. Amida means to stand in one place, Hiluch means to go, and movement, and Dilug is jumping over, skipping over. Now the Rebbe explains that it's not possible that Amida means purely standing in one place, because since it's a type of Avodah, and as we say that the difference between the Neshama before it came down into the body, and the Neshama once it comes down into the body, is that the Neshama before it comes down into the body, as well as also the Malachim, the angels in the spiritual worlds, they're called Oimdim, standing, whereas a neshama in the body is called mahalchim, one who goes and moves. The malachim and the neshamas up there, they're not just standing in one place, they're constantly having different type of avodah. Michael, the camp of Michael is on the right side, avodah of avas Hashem, of loving Hashem, moving constantly from one level to the next. You can't be standing in one place. Similarly, also Gabriel on the left side is the avodah of Yiras Hashem, of fear and awe of Hashem. It means a constant movement towards further and further, going towards the idea of Yiras Hashem. So it's self-understood, therefore, that Amida doesn't just mean standing in one place, that my today is like yesterday and my tomorrow is like today. Rather, it means that I'm moving, there's movement, but the movement is a limited movement. It's one which is in comparison, one which is connected somehow to the previous state that I was in. Whereas mahalech, to go, true going, means going from one place to the other, going to a level where I'm completely beyond any limitation whatsoever. And in order to explain this, the Rebbe explains that in understanding, there's two types of understanding. One can understand the regular type of understanding, is that I understand something deeper and deeper, both in quality and in quantity. But what I knew earlier, all my previous knowledge helps to further my present knowledge or my future knowledge. But then there's an idea like we find by Reb Zeda, that Reb Zeda, before he went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, he had to fast 40 fasts, or 100 fasts according to another opinion, in order to forget everything he learned in Talmud Bavli, so that it shouldn't confuse him when he's learning Talmud Yerushalmi. It wasn't an additional understanding, an added understanding that the more I know, the more I can understand. But rather he was going from one type of understanding to a totally different level, which is beyond anything that he learned earlier, the extent that whatever he learned earlier would confuse him to the understanding of this new deeper, and not just deeper, but totally unconnected, totally beyond all limitations, the understanding that he was getting to now. And that's what happens to Neshama when it has to go from this world to the next. That before the Neshama is able to appreciate or have any connection to Gan Eden, it has to first dip in Nahar Dinur, in the river of fire, so that it should forget Chezu Dahai Alma. It should forget the entire sight and any connection to this physical world. And only then can it appreciate the spiritual hasagas, the spiritual understanding, and the spiritual revelations of Gan Eden. Now when we talk about it going from this world to the next and going through Nahar Dinur, it's not just to forget the concept of Taivas Isser, of forbidden desires. That is obvious. That isn't even connected to Nahar Dinur. For that there's Gehenna. Even Taivas Heter, permitted desires in this world, is also not something that we're dealing with once it's going into Nahar Dinur. What the Neshama is dealing with is even holiness. Any type of spiritual connection, even something connected to this physical world, doesn't enable it to be able to connect to a higher spiritual revelation in the spiritual worlds. To understand this idea a little bit further, we can give an example of a famous story. They asked once a chassid, in the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, what's the connection? What kind of relation is there between you and Reb Hillel Paritcher? Reb Hillel Paritcher was also a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, who had been a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, but it was known that Reb Hillel Paritcher was like half a Rebbe. He was on a level that he himself would say Mamarim of Chassidus. He was on a level where he was in a complete holy level. He was what was called half a Rebbe. And so the Chassid said, the relationship between Reb Hillel Paritcher and me, and this was a great Chassid, also this Chassid, is like the difference between a human and a cat. And he explained that doesn't mean that as far distance as there is between a human and a cat, that's what type of distance there is between Reb Hillel and me. Because that would still be something that's in comparison, a very distant comparison, but it's still some type of comparison. But rather, that the distance compared to Reb Hillel, myself and the cat are equally the same. That's called a level which is incomparable. And that's the idea of the difference between finite and infinite. The difference and the relation, the ratio between 1 and 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 or 100 billion is still some type of ratio, because it's 100 billion times becomes 100 billion. But yet the difference between 1 and infinity, or the difference between 0 and 1, that's a difference which is totally infinite. It's two different worlds. And similarly over here, the difference between Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi is not just that Talmud Yerushalmi is deeper, it's greater, etc. It's two different worlds. There's the world of Talmud Bavli, which is called B'machshakim Shivani. That's a world in which one is involved in the darkness of the world. And within that darkness, he's finding the great understanding of godliness. And there's Talmud Yerushalmi, which is in a way of light. The difference between darkness and light is not that this is dark, this is light. It's not something that you can compare in a way of a quality or quantity connection. It's like the idea of explain to someone who never saw in their life, explain to them the idea of colors. It's not something that's explainable because it's on a totally different realm. The difference in realm between Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi, and similarly over here, a neshama that's going from one level to the next, in quality and quantity, it's constantly moving forward, but it never went anywhere. You can't call it mahalech, it's still standing in the same place. That same place is growing greater and greater. Mahalech means to go from one place to a totally different place. And that's the meaning of the word mahalech. Now that idea of mahalech, of going, is something that the neshama can reach specifically only when it comes down into the body, into this physical world. While the neshama is in the spiritual world, it's also in constraints. Its constraints are its emotions and its intellect. It's limited by its own nature, by its own spiritual nature. But it can never leave those constraints fully. It will go greater. It will have a greater understanding and a greater feeling, but it will never leave those constraints. Whereas when the neshama comes down into this world, and over here it has to deal with the constraints of not its own, but of the nefesh habahamis, of the animal soul, of the physical body. Since it's not its own constraints, these constraints, the meisar of the physical body, pushes the neshama out of its own constraints, that it's no longer limited into its own seichel and midas. It becomes a mahalech. It moves, it goes further. And that's like the difference between Seder Ishtalshalus and beyond Seder Ishtalshalus. Seder Ishtalshalus, the word Ishtalshalus means a chain. Seder Ishtalshalus is the chain of godly light that comes into this world. But it's like a chain where the highest link of the chain is connected somewhat to the lowest link of the chain. There could be millions of links in the chain, but there's always going to be a connection. Because in the end of the day, the highest link, as it goes further and multiplies and goes from one link to the next, it has some type of relation to the lowest link of the chain. Whereas beyond Seder Ishtalshalus means to go beyond, to go out of that chain, to remove oneself from that chain and to be connected to a totally different level, which is beyond anything that it was earlier. And that's the purpose, the ultimate purpose of the neshama coming down into this body, is to become a mahalech, to leave its constraints. Through the fact that the neshama is connected to the body and to the animal soul, it feels the constraints of the animal soul, it leaves the constraints of intellect and emotions, and it's no longer connected to Seder Ishtalshalus. And that's what we said also earlier with regards to the levels of bitachon. As long as the bitachon is in a way of Zeir Anpin, which is midas, but it's called Zeir Anpin, the small face, which adds the midas, the emotions, which is the light that shines into the world, is called a small face, no matter how spiritual that light is. It's in a way that it had to come through a tzimtzum, it had to be condensed to come into the world. That level of bitachon is still small, it's still limited within the emotions. Even the one that comes from moichin, from intellect, which is higher than Zeir Anpin, that's called Abba V'Ima, the father and the mother, which means it's not as limited, because its intellect is something which goes beyond just the natural instinct. A person can change it in their minds, in the mashal of the physical person. Yet it's still limited to the intellect. Keser, on the other hand, the crown which is above Ishtalshalus, it's above the world. That's the etzem, the essence, the desire and the pleasure. That has no connection to the world whatsoever. That's the bitachon, which is in a total essence. That's what goes beyond all constraints. That's what goes beyond all limitations. However, and in Mitzvah Hashem, tomorrow we're going to continue more with this. that even the avodah which is higher than tam v'das, it's higher than understanding, not just higher than emotions, but even higher than intellect. Nevertheless, that's still only called mahalech. It's going, yes, it goes beyond limitations. The person left totally his own nature of intellect and emotions and connected to the essence and the reality of godliness, something which is beyond me, but yet he's still mahalech, that still hasn't gone to madalig, which is skipping, which is something which is even higher than that.